So this game was the final round, 28th round. Imagine that, a 28-round tournament. Oof. This was played October 29th, 1959. And his opponent, Vasily Smyslov, born in Moscow, March 24th, 1921. Smyslov was not only a great chess player, but he was a very talented singer, a rich baritone voice he had. And he narrowly missed joining the Bolshoi Opera. Well, opera's loss was the chess world's gain. He became a Soviet grandmaster in 1941. Back in those days, there was national grandmaster and international grandmaster. Nowadays, the national grandmaster titles have been dropped in order to eliminate any confusion. But even in our country, we used to have a USCF grandmaster title. But once the FIDE standardized the international grandmaster, we eventually dropped that. Anyway, he was Moscow champion in 1942. The first time he ever beat Botvinnik was at Moscow Championship of 1943. He was Moscow champion 1944, 45. He was the world sub-champion in 1948. He shared first place in 1949 with David Bronstein in the Soviet Championship. He won the Chigorin Memorial Tournament in 1951. He had success at Zurich 1953, becoming the challenger to the title in 54. That match was tied, and thus Botvinnik retained the title. He once again became Soviet champion in 1955 and again became the winner of the candidates tournament at Amsterdam in 56 after winning the Alekhine Memorial Tournament, in which he's drawing against Botvinnik in their individual game. And thus, the path was paved to become the 7th world champion against Botvinnik in 1957. But it was a short-lived crown because Botvinnik somehow managed a rematch the following year and regained the title. But Smyslov would go on to quite a few tournament victories, including Amsterdam 1964, Havana 1965, which he won ahead of Bobby Fischer, Monte Carlo in 1969. In 1982, at the Las Palmas Interzonal Tournament, he finished second place and qualified for the candidates, and at age 61 advanced past Dr. Robert Hubner in the quarterfinals. He defeated Zoltan Ribli, who I guess was Hungarian, I think, if I remember correctly, in the semifinals. Only one person stood between him and challenging for the world title, and that was Garry Kasparov, and of course Garry defeated him in the finals. Smyslov crowned his remarkable career by becoming the first senior world champion at Bad Wörishofen in 1991. Smyslov passed away March 27, 2010, at the age of 89. So let's get into it. E4 from Smyslov. C5 is your Sicilian defense. Knight F3, pawn D6, pawn D4, pawn takes pawn, knight takes the pawn. Your open Sicilian. Knight F6, knight C3, no surprises, another Najdorf's variation. Bishop G5, pawn E6, pawn F4, bishop E7, queen F3, and another traditional line with queen C7. Queenside castles and another main line with queen's knight to D7. Now G4, pawn B5, bishop takes knight, knight takes the bishop, pawn G5, hitting the knight, knight back to D7, bishop H3. Marked inaccurate. Obviously, the more common move, well, there's two lines in the ECO that I'll go over here. F5 was marked by the bot here. In response to this, you see F5 highlighted by the bot. That is a book move, and that's answered by bishop takes pawn check. That forces king to B1, and then knight E5 hits the queen. Queen H5 hits the bishop, and that's answered by queen D8. I've shown that line quite a few times, but I might as well show it again. Another line is pawn A3 right here. That's a book move. And that's answered with rook B8, pawn H4, pawn B4, pawn takes pawn, and rook takes pawn. So a couple of different ways to play this line. In this game, Smyslov with bishop H3. Pawn b4 here, hitting the knight, and that knight retreats to the e2 square. Bishop b7, bot not liking that. Knight c5, by the way, is the usual move. Bobby with bishop b7 in this game. King b1, big red X. The bot, what a move. This is quite a move. Look at this. The bot calling for bishop takes the pawn, sacrificing the bishop for 3 pawns, right? Got to move your queen somewhere, and then, that's marked inaccurate, but the point is I'm getting check here. Boom, picking up 3 pawns. King b1. Now knight c5 is played. Knight g3, pawn d5. Yeah, I see. The point of g6 is to hold this g-man in place with the idea of pawn to h6. Bobby with d5, f5. Pawn takes pawn, queen g4. Queen e3 better. Keep this pawn blockaded, right? I guess is the point. But queen g4 was played. Pawn takes the pawn, hitting the queen. Right, queen e5. Well, queen e5 will bring about pawn takes pawn here, right? You know what would be really interesting is the castle here. What do I get for queenside castles? I get a thumbs up. This is quite a move. Let's think about this. On pawn takes pawn, knight takes the pawn. Okay, it says pawn takes the pawn, but it doesn't matter, right? Because knight's going to take the knight, and pawn will take the knight, and then queen will take the pawn and force the king to b8. So it doesn't really matter, because you get the same thing either way. The move order is irrelevant, right? You get the same exact thing. How could that be an inaccuracy now and before it was correct? Come on, Ficklebot. All right, so move order doesn't matter. Cute little line there that went through my brain, but let's come back to where we were. So e takes f5 was played by Fischer. Now the knight on d4 takes this pawn. I was expecting him to capture with the other knight. Hey, bot agrees with me for a change. Take with the g knight, and then bishop to f8 has to be played, and then you can get this rook into the game. Or not. I've had a few double exclams tonight, but I feel like I've had more derogatory marks than marks of merit. Anyway, e takes f5, knight d takes f5, and now g6 hits the knight. Knight takes the bishop. I had this idea of sacrificing the knight and bring this rook into the game. This is marked as a mistake. The bot calling for knight h6. Can I not sacrifice this knight and bring my rook over? The bot says yes. I get a star. And the point is, after takes and takes, you have quite an interesting fight going on here. Although the bot's still favoring black. Barely, though. It's 0.5, which is equal for all intents and purposes. All right, g6, knight takes the bishop, queen takes the knight, queen f4, inaccurate. He finally castles, rook d6. Right, bishop g4 might have been a move here, so you can get out of the way of this pawn. Check mark there. Rook d6. Queen's rook to d8, rook f6, rook d5. Now bishop g4 is played. Knight d7 hitting the rook. Marked as a mistake. Ah, yes. Yeah, I guess he's got better winning chances by pushing the pawn. Push the pawn. And really, I'm going to get both of my rooks on this file. And white's got to be concerned about that. Rook d5, bishop g4, knight d7. Rook f1 sacks the rook. There's a little trap here to avoid. Don't take that pawn because, hello, even if you defend, well, you can't. You could try rook d1. No, it doesn't really work because I still have a super attack here, don't I? So rook d1, rook takes rook, bishop takes rook, and then bishop takes knight, and I'm up a piece. So watch out for those supposedly free pawns. Rook f1 was played, and do not take the rook. Do not take the rook. He played e3. Do not play knight takes the rook here. On knight takes the rook, pawn takes the knight, and guess what? I guess you could, no, it doesn't work. Even a counterattack just doesn't work. Probably your best try, but yeah, you're just doomed. Just don't take the rook. That's the point I'm trying to make. Do not take the rook. e3 is the right move. b3, bishop f3. Wow. Create a skewer there, and that would force rook b5, wouldn't it? Because you're skewering the rook and the bishop, so I'd have to defend. And then you could just ignore it and come right back. We have b3 here. Rook d2. Bishop takes the knight. Yeah, queen c7 might be more hopeful. Attacking the bishop and, of course, covering the c5 square because the black queen wants to come to c5. So if he does, then we're going to capture it. And then rook e1 takes care of that, and it has the best chance of holding there. Obviously, the point here is queen c5. You can't take the bishop because you're mated. Take your pick of mates here or here. So that's the idea of queen c7. But bishop takes knight was played. And this game is getting away from Smyslov. In fact, it has gotten away from Smyslov. This is pretty decisive already for Fischer. Rook takes the bishop. Rook e1. Rook e8. Rook c8. Yeah, because queen c5 again would be winning. He'd have to play something like knight f1 here. But in that event, I'm probably could play e2. I might be able to play queen c5 anyway. I get a star for e2. What about just playing queen c5 anyway? No, I was right. I should have stuck with the original. All right, so rook e8 was played here. h4, it gets a check mark. I really thought he should bring this rook over here to b6. I get a star for his best fighting chances, although, as you can see, it's really not that much help. But queen c5, h4, queen c5 played here, and queen c4, a miserable choice to have to play. Queen takes the queen, pawn takes the queen, rook d4. It's looking pretty ugly here. c5, rook takes h4, and rook g4 is going to be a winning move now, isn't it? c6, last-ditch effort to try to make good on this passed pawn. Bishop c8, he can just park there, frankly. Rook d6, rook c4, getting behind that pawn. King b2, king g7, king b3, putting the question to the rook. What's he going to do? Well, he goes to g4. Hitting the knight, knight comes to e2. Well, rook e6 played here, wanting to compel a trade. Rook e d1, defending the rook. Rook g2, attacking the knight. Knight f4, hitting the rook and the rook. Not as good as it looks. This passed pawn is a monster, to say the least. Besides, I can rook takes rook, and it negates your fork. Rook takes rook, and rook d2. What a move. Rook d3, definitely don't want to take, and then that pawn cannot be stopped. Rook f2, rook d4, tries to defend. According to the bot, your best bet is to take that pawn. That pawn is worth more than that knight, and I'll remind you that when pawns cross the equator, they increase in value. It goes from a 1-point pawn to a 2-point pawn to a 4-point pawn, which means it's worth a point more than a knight, to a 6-point pawn to a 9-point pawn, otherwise known as a queen. But rook d4 was played, e2 is played. We get knight d3, bishop f5, double exclam, and he simply wants to remove that defender of the promotion square. You can have my rook because I'm promoting. This not only threatens bishop takes knight, but it prevents the rook from getting behind the pawn. So it's a glorious move. And please take my rook. c7 is a lame effort. Knight e1, the bot says, just blockade. That's your best hope. But as you can see, the eval bar is so strong in our favor. And if you play your knight there, I'm just going to go ahead and bonk your knight out of there. So c7, it's his last-ditch try. It's not going to work. Rook f3. Yeah, right. The easiest approach is to just remove the defender. I don't know why Bobby's getting cute with rook f3. Because I'm just going to promote now. I guess Bobby just wanted to avoid c8 here in this position. I don't know. I gather. I'm going to assume that's the case. He didn't like the idea of having to deal with any complications or counterplay. So he played rook f3. Now this does promote, but my bishop is still there to capture. But now he does get behind my pawn. But bishop comes back to f4 and says, that's all right. You can have my pawn. I will simplify. And one thing Bobby Fischer was great at, it was simplification. So after rook takes pawn, bishop takes the knight, pawn takes the bishop, rook takes the pawn, pawn check. King takes the pawn. Now rook d5. Boom. Rook g2 tries to defend. Bobby is up 2 full pawns here. So h6 tries to get rid of 1 and takes. Then a4, g5, rook c2, rook d6, preventing the rook from coming to c6. King c5, rook e6, and black is victorious. Vasily Smyslov resigned in this position. 2 passed pawns to the good is more than enough.